Dorothy Harris stepped into the glass-paneled showroom of Delacroix Motors with a quiet grace that only life's hardest lessons could teach. At 65 years old, her posture carried the elegance of a woman who had survived decades of being told she didn't belong, yet stood taller each time. Her hair, tightly coiled and silver at the edges, framed a face lined not just by age, but by experience. Her hands, though weathered, moved with purpose as she clutched a leather folder and adjusted the strap of her purse. She had come to buy a car. What she received instead was a reckoning. The first thing she noticed wasn't the shine of the cars or the quiet hum of classical music floating through the speakers. It was the air itself, stiff, suspicious, curated like fine china. As she walked further in, heads turned, but not in greeting. They tilted slightly, eyes narrowing for just a beat longer than necessary, and then flicked away like she was background noise disrupting a pristine painting. Dorothy paused near a sleek black coupe, its chrome reflecting the morning sun. She reached out and brushed a gentle hand across the hood, her fingertips skimming the surface like it was a memory. Her late husband had always dreamed of owning one just like it. They used to pass dealerships, like this one, and make silent promises to each other. One day, when the bills were paid, and the children grown, and the world felt a little less like it was working against them. Today was supposed to be that day. From the far end of the showroom, a man in a tailored gray suit watched her. His name was Brent Caldwell. Young, sharp, and arrogant enough to believe he could tell someone's net worth by their shoes. To Brent, Dorothy didn't fit the profile of a serious buyer. Her beige cardigan and modest slacks didn't scream luxury. Her skin, dark and smooth, set against a sea of white marble floors and white faces, stood out more than he liked. Without checking her paperwork, without saying a word, he labeled her with the certainty of a man who had never been told he was wrong. He leaned over to whisper to a colleague, a smirk creeping across his face. "Looks like someone's grandma got lost on her morning walk." The words weren't meant to be loud, but they were meant to be heard. Dorothy heard them. She turned slightly, but didn't say a word. Silence had long been her weapon and her shield. She had endured worse. At lunch counters, in classrooms, in waiting rooms where she was told she didn't belong. But that didn't mean the sting had faded with age. It only meant she'd learned how to absorb it without showing the bruise. Brent approached with the fake smile of a man who had decided he was still in control. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" His tone was laced with faux politeness, like he was doing her a favor just by speaking. "Yes," Dorothy replied, her voice clear and calm. "I'm interested in test driving the new Sedaris 500. Black, leather interior, fully loaded. I believe you have one in stock." Brent blinked. Once. Twice. The confidence wavered, just slightly, before snapping back into place. "That's one of our premium vehicles. Most customers start by browsing the base models, you know. Something a little more budget-friendly." Dorothy didn't flinch. "I know what I came for." He hesitated, then gestured half-heartedly toward the reception desk. "Why don't I have someone get you a brochure while you think it over?" But she wasn't here for a brochure. She was here to write a check. Across the room, another salesman, a younger woman named Alicia, watched in quiet disbelief. She'd seen Brent do this before. Dismiss people based on nothing more than a hunch, a prejudice he barely bothered to hide. Alicia had learned early to keep her head down. Delacroix Motors wasn't a place that rewarded courage, especially not from women like her. Still, something about the way Dorothy held her ground sparked something beneath Alicia's hesitation. But before she could act, Brent made a snap decision. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said suddenly, louder now, drawing the attention of several nearby customers. "Unless you're here to make a purchase, I'll have to ask you to leave. We don't allow loitering." Loitering. The word hit harder than any insult could have. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the way it reduced her, made invisible all her years of work, all her sacrifice, all her right to be in that room. Dorothy's fingers tightened slightly around her folder. Inside was her pre-approval letter, her financial statements, her portfolio, every document she needed to buy, not just the Sidari's 500, but the entire showroom if she wanted to. But she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply smiled. And that was what shook him. Not anger, not defiance. Just the quiet, chilling certainty of a woman who knew exactly who she was, and who knew that 5 minutes from now, everything would change. Because Brent Caldwell had just made the single worst mistake of his career. He judged a woman by her appearance. What he didn't know was that the woman he had just tried to humiliate wasn't just a customer. She was the majority shareholder of Delacroix Motors. The air inside Delacroix Motors had shifted. It wasn't a gust or a crack. It was subtler than that, like the temperature of a room dropping by a few degrees without anyone adjusting the thermostat. Brent Caldwell returned to his desk with the swagger of someone who thought they had just put an old woman in her place. He leaned back in his leather chair, tossing a pen between his fingers, not realizing the storm he'd just set in motion. The smirks exchanged with his colleagues were short-lived, shallow laughs echoing from a place of entitlement, not understanding. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, alive with awareness. Alicia Monroe, still stationed by the receptionist's desk, watched Dorothy step out into the sunlight beyond the dealership's pristine glass doors. Dorothy hadn't yelled. She hadn't caused a scene. She had simply walked away, dignity intact, like someone who knew where real power came from. Alicia's heart twisted. She had grown up with women like Dorothy, women who bore the brunt of other people's ignorance with more grace than the world deserved. And in her gut, she knew something bigger was about to happen. Meanwhile, in the break room, whispers traveled like wildfire. One of the interns, Jackson, nudged another employee and muttered, "Did you see how she looked at Brent? Like she wasn't even bothered. That's not the look of someone walking away defeated." Brent, however, was too proud to notice the tension. He was already back on his phone, texting his girlfriend, boasting about how he had handled another window shopper. His arrogance wasn't just ignorance. It was a reflex, built from years of being told he was the best and never being held accountable for how he treated others. But karma, as it often does, doesn't arrive with a warning. It arrives disguised as an email notification. At precisely 11:27 a.m., Brent's screen lit up with a message from the regional office. Immediate compliance meeting scheduled at 12 p.m., attendance mandatory. All team leads required to be present. CEO to join via live feed. The subject line was marked urgent, and beneath it, in bold, concerning incident reported at the Manhattan showroom. Brent frowned, confused. He wasn't aware of any incident worth corporate attention, unless someone had dared to file a complaint. He looked around. The showroom had returned to its quiet rhythm, yet the staff weren't quite the same. The laughter had dulled. The movements were stiffer, more cautious. The receptionist had gone pale, and even Rick, the general manager, was unusually quiet. By 11:45, the entire leadership staff was summoned to the glass conference room near the back of the dealership. Brent strutted in first, followed closely by Rick, who checked his watch nervously. Alicia lingered at the doorway before slipping into a corner seat, uncertain why she had been called. When the large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, everyone turned their attention to it, expecting a briefing on quarterly sales targets or marketing updates. Instead, the face that appeared belonged to someone few at the showroom had ever seen in person. Elias Warren, CEO of Delacroix Motors, didn't speak right away. His face was calm, but his eyes were anything but. He sat behind a sleek desk in the company's San Francisco headquarters, flanked by two legal advisors and the company's HR director. A hushed murmur spread across the room. Then Elias leaned forward, folded his hands, and said, "This morning, at approximately 10:04 a.m., a discriminatory incident occurred in one of our flagship showrooms. It involved a longtime board member, a woman of remarkable standing and influence within our company, who was not only dismissed as a customer, but was asked to leave the premises." There was a ripple of shock. Brent straightened in his seat, suddenly alert. Rick's breath caught audibly. Elias continued, "That woman was Miss Dorothy Harris." Brent felt the blood drain from his face. "As of this moment," Elias said, his tone sharper now, "Ms. Harris has filed a formal grievance. But more than that, she has escalated this matter to the full board, and as the primary shareholder in our Northeast division, she has the authority to call an emergency leadership audit, which she has." Brent opened his mouth, but Rick elbowed him sharply. "Don't speak," Rick hissed under his breath. Alicia, across the room, stared at the screen, stunned. The woman she had watched get humiliated, calm, composed, and unshakable, wasn't just someone's grandmother. She was one of the reasons this dealership even existed. Elias continued, "What is most disturbing about this situation is not that Ms. Harris was mistaken for a casual browser. It's that her presence, her age, her appearance triggered assumptions that violated our core values. That's not just poor judgment. That's systemic bias, and it ends today." The silence in the room was suffocating. Elias paused before concluding, "You will be contacted individually regarding the outcome of this incident. Disciplinary action will be swift. For now, operations in this location are to be paused pending internal review." And with that, the feed cut. Brent sat frozen. He wasn't sure if it was anger, fear, or disbelief that gripped him. Maybe all three. But he knew something had changed. He could feel it in the way the staff avoided his gaze. In the way Alicia finally looked him in the eye, not with fear, but with quiet judgment. Rick broke the silence. We didn't know who she was," Alicia replied, her voice low but resolute. "You shouldn't have needed to." Outside the conference room, the usual hum of the dealership had dimmed. Some customers were still browsing, unaware of the firestorm brewing behind the tinted glass. But among the staff, the echoes of what had happened, what they had allowed to happen, rang louder than any engine ever could. Because Dorothy Harris had not raised her voice, but her silence had thundered, and Delacroix Motors would never be the same again. Rain had begun to fall lightly outside Delacroix Motors, the kind of fine mist that blurred the windows and left the city looking as if it were breathing through glass. Inside, the tension in the showroom was thicker than ever. Conversations had grown hushed, glances sharp. Staff who once strutted around the floor with the confidence of gatekeepers now hovered with nervous energy, their eyes darting to doors, to phones, to one another. The space that once seemed designed to impress had turned cold, clinical, like a waiting room for accountability. Brent was still reeling. Every corner of his pride was bruised, not by a raised voice or public embarrassment, but by the slow realization that he had just dismissed a woman who held the keys to his professional future. Worse, she hadn't needed to make a scene to undo him. Her silence had traveled faster than gossip ever could, reaching the top before he even left the floor. He sat in the manager's office now, staring at the wall, Rick beside him in the same state of disbelief. Their arrogance, once synchronized, now sat between them like a broken contract. "We didn't know," Brent muttered, his voice stripped of its usual sharpness. Rick looked at him, the lines in his face more defined than they had been an hour earlier. "That's not a defense, Brent. That's the problem." Meanwhile, Alicia had taken a brief break to step outside. The drizzle fell gently against her blazer as she stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the shift of air. She had worked in retail long enough to know that sometimes storms didn't make noise. They came in the form of reckoning, and this one was just beginning. Her phone buzzed, a text from someone on the administrative floor. "She's coming back." And she's not alone. Alicia turned toward the street, just in time to see a sleek black Cadillac SUV glide up to the dealership entrance. The back door opened first. Out stepped Dorothy Harris, now dressed in a charcoal gray coat and polished leather shoes, her posture straight, gaze unwavering. She carried herself not like someone returning to finish a purchase, but like someone returning to reclaim something that had never been anyone else's to deny. Behind her came two others, an older man in a bespoke navy suit, and a younger woman in tailored slacks, carrying a leather portfolio. The man was Samuel Granger, senior partner at the firm that handled Delacroix's legal affairs. The woman was Lorraine Price, VP of Corporate Ethics. Their presence was not just symbolic, it was structural. Change wasn't being suggested, it was being enforced. The glass doors slid open, and the sound of heels on marble cut clean through the low jazz playing overhead. Dorothy didn't pause. The receptionist stood abruptly, mouth parted, unsure whether to greet or apologize. Dorothy simply nodded and walked past her. Alicia slipped back inside, her breath held. By the time Dorothy reached the center of the showroom, all eyes were on her. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't raise her voice. But the space bent around her, as though acknowledging a shift in gravity. This time, she wasn't alone. And she wasn't here to ask for anything. She was here to address everything. Rick emerged first, trying to reclaim his authority with a forced smile. "Ms. Harris," he began, "I want to personally extend—" "Stop," Dorothy said gently, but firmly. "Not because I'm offended, but because the apology you're about to give doesn't come from understanding. And I don't need empty theater." Rick froze. Brent, who had crept into view behind him, flinched at the sight of Dorothy's legal team. Dorothy turned to Samuel, who stepped forward and began reading a statement. A formal declaration of policy violation, internal review status, and the upcoming structural audit to assess discriminatory behavior across Delacroix's retail locations. It was worded in polished legalese, but the heart of it was clear. This wasn't about one employee's mistake. This was about a culture that had permitted judgment to dress itself up as professionalism. As Samuel spoke, Dorothy's eyes scanned the room. She could see the discomfort, the embarrassment, but she could also see hope, most clearly in Alicia, who stood near the desk, hands folded, head high. When the statement concluded, Dorothy spoke again. "This isn't about punishing a few people to make an example," she said quietly, "though actions have consequences. This is about correcting something far more dangerous, something invisible until it isn't." She let the silence settle. "You judged me because of how I looked, because I didn't fit your mental mold of what wealth should look like. You saw my age, my skin, my bag, and decided I wasn't worth your time." Brent dropped his gaze. "But what if I wasn't a shareholder? What if I was just a woman trying to buy a car after a lifetime of saving? Would your treatment have been different? Would I be more deserving of kindness if I could prove my worth to you?" No one answered. They didn't have to. Dorothy turned to Alicia. "What's your name?" Alicia blinked. "Alicia Monroe." "You watched. You felt it. But you didn't add to it," Dorothy said. "That might seem small, but when silence is everywhere, choosing not to pile on is a start." Alicia swallowed, unsure how to respond. Dorothy nodded, as if that was enough. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I've spent enough of my life walking around people's expectations. But I do want you to remember something," she continued. "Every person who walks through those doors deserves dignity, not because of what they own, but because of who they are." She gestured toward the cars gleaming behind her. "You sell vehicles that promise freedom, status, elegance. But if the way you treat people contradicts what you're selling, then you're not in the business of transportation. You're in the business of exclusion." The weight of her words settled like morning fog, soft, but impossible to ignore. Lorraine Price stepped forward next, explaining that training would be mandatory, evaluations would be recurring, and compliance would be monitored directly by corporate from that day forward. Delacroix wouldn't just recover, it would reform. Dorothy turned once more to the team. "I didn't come here to change your minds. I came here to change your systems." With that, she walked back toward the exit, each step deliberate, her legacy echoing louder than any reprimand could. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky hadn't cleared completely, but light was beginning to filter through the clouds. Back inside, no one moved. The storm had returned, but not to destroy, to rebuild. The morning after Dorothy Harris returned to Delacroix Motors, the dealership did not open with the usual clink of keys and casual banter. Instead, the staff were summoned early. Every employee, from sales associates to inventory clerks, asked to report for a mandatory meeting in the main showroom. The usual polished cars and gleaming tile floors looked the same, but the atmosphere was palpably different. Nervous glances were exchanged. No one knew quite what to expect. The air was thick with anticipation as Dorothy stood at the center of the room, no longer simply a woman dismissed by assumptions, but a force reconfiguring the foundation of the place. She was joined by Lorraine Price, the VP of Corporate Ethics, and a small team from the parent company. Behind them, easels displayed presentation boards, values, restructuring plans, diversity accountability statements, symbols of a culture overhaul that was no longer just promised, but required. Dorothy didn't speak first. Instead, Lorraine stepped forward and addressed the team with calm authority. She explained that the events of the previous day were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a deeper problem. The company had failed, not just because of two employees, but because it had allowed a culture of exclusion to thrive unchecked. But now, that would change. Not with hollow apologies, but with action. There will be training, Lorraine said clearly. But more importantly, there will be transparency. You will not be evaluated only on sales performance, but on how you uphold the values of inclusion and respect. We are not just changing policies. We are rewriting the rules of who we are and how we operate. She gestured toward the front desk. Effective today, Alicia Monroe has been promoted to Senior Customer Liaison. Her calm during yesterday's events and her instincts to observe, listen, and treat every guest with decency were exactly what we hope to see in all of you. Alicia's eyes widened, stunned. Her colleagues clapped lightly, more in surprise than celebration. But Dorothy smiled. It was a subtle moment, a recognition not just of Alicia's character, but a signal to the others. Kindness was no longer optional. It was the new standard. Dorothy finally spoke. I didn't come back here to embarrass anyone, but I also didn't come to be erased. We've all seen how assumptions shape outcomes, how people are excluded based on the clothes they wear, the cars they drive, the color of their skin. I've seen it my entire life, but this time, I had the power to push back. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. And I'm going to use that power not to punish, but to build. Delacroix will become a place where dignity walks through the door before status does. A place where people are seen not just as sales targets, but as humans, as individuals, as equals. There was a silence after she spoke, not awkward, but reflective. Even those who had once chuckled behind polished desks now stood with their heads slightly bowed. Over the next few days, the transformation began in earnest. The training wasn't just a slideshow of corporate buzzwords. It was immersive, raw, honest. Experts in racial bias and customer equity led sessions that prompted uncomfortable conversations. Staff were encouraged to speak openly about what they'd witnessed, where they had remained silent, and how to move forward. Dorothy didn't just observe, she participated. She shared her experiences, asked questions, and listened. Her presence was not ceremonial, it was transformational. The dealership underwent more than just cultural change. It was redesigned physically, too. A new welcome desk stood closer to the entrance, designed to ensure every visitor was greeted promptly and respectfully. A quiet lounge replaced the exclusive champagne bar, offering a more inclusive, professional experience for all customers, not just the ones in designer labels. Martha, the junior employee who had watched everything unfold, found herself pulled into more meetings, asked for input, and slowly mentored by Alicia. She hadn't expected her quiet moment of empathy to matter, but now she was being shown that integrity, even in whispers, could reshape the world. As for Brent and Rick, their absence was never officially addressed to the public. Their names weren't scrubbed from history, but they were replaced by new voices, new stories. And those stories began to redefine Delacroix's legacy. By the end of the week, the dealership didn't just feel different, it was different. Customers who had once walked in with apprehension now found a sense of welcome. Staff no longer looked at people as profiles, but as people. And those who remained understood. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a responsibility. Dorothy Harris didn't need to put her name on the building. She had already carved it into its future. In the months that followed, Dorothy Harris's quiet revolution at Delacroix Motors, the dealership didn't just survive, it flourished. But the real measure of success wasn't in sales numbers or quarterly growth. It was in the subtle, powerful shifts that unfolded behind the scenes. Shifts in attitude, in practice, and in belief. Customers began to take notice, not just of the polished cars on display, but of the way they were greeted with sincerity rather than scrutiny. People of all backgrounds, young professionals, retirees, immigrants, single mothers, walked through the doors and were met with warmth. No one asked about income before asking about needs. No one looked twice at worn shoes or aging handbags. Respect, once selectively distributed, had become universal. Alicia Monroe, now leading the Customer Experience Division, oversaw new training programs and spearheaded community engagement efforts. Her team partnered with local schools to host mentorship events and launched weekend car care clinics for single parents and seniors. The dealership became more than a showroom. It became a hub of belonging. Martha, once timid and afraid to speak up, blossomed under guidance and trust. She was now managing a team of her own, often reflecting on that moment when her small act of courage had met someone else's mountain of strength. Kindness, she would tell new hires, isn't weakness. It's what builds everything that lasts. And as for Dorothy, she returned from time to time, not to inspect, but to connect. She'd stroll through the showroom, sharing stories with staff and customers alike. No longer a stranger, no longer underestimated. She didn't need reminders of her power. She saw it in every handshake, every welcoming smile, every policy that had been rewritten in the wake of one defining moment. Her journey, built on decades of perseverance and grace, had not only reclaimed her dignity, it had set a new standard, one that challenged an industry to do better, one that reminded every person who walked through those glass doors that presence is not proven by status, but by how you treat those who walk beside you. Dorothy Harris's story wasn't just about a car, a dealership, or even a moment of public humiliation. It was about resilience, identity, and the power of self-worth in a world that often misjudges at first glance. From the moment she stepped into Delacroix Motors, Dorothy carried with her not just years of experience, but a legacy of perseverance carved through decades of pushing uphill, defying expectations placed upon her because of her age, her skin, or her silence. What unfolded that day wasn't a confrontation, it was a revelation. The arrogance of Tom and Rick, their dismissive laughter, their assumptions cloaked in professional etiquette, became symbols of a much larger issue. But what they failed to see was that the woman they had dismissed was a force far greater than their polished resumes and tailored suits. Dorothy had built something that couldn't be priced: dignity. And when they tried to strip that from her, she didn't retaliate with rage. She responded with grace, with action, and with the quiet kind of power that changes the world. The transformation of Delacroix Motors was not an act of revenge. It was a renewal. Dorothy didn't just demand respect for herself. She ensured it for every person who would walk through those doors after her. Through her courage and clarity, she turned a moment of exclusion into a movement of inclusion. The staff, the policies, even the purpose of the dealership shifted because one woman refused to be belittled. So, what do we take from Dorothy's story? We learn that standing tall in the face of disrespect doesn't require shouting. It requires knowing your worth. We learn that leadership isn't about position, but about character. And most importantly, we learn that lasting change doesn't always begin in courts or headlines. It can start with one person refusing to back down. In your own life, remember this: when the world underestimates you, let your silence be preparation, not defeat. Let your actions rewrite assumptions. Let your dignity be louder than prejudice. Whether in a dealership, a boardroom, or a neighborhood sidewalk, stand your ground. And when you rise, reach back and lift someone else with you. If Dorothy's story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the strength we each carry, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel and help us continue sharing stories that shine a light on truth, dignity, and justice. Your support helps keep voices like Dorothy's alive, reminding the world what real power looks like. Because stories like this don't just deserve to be heard, they deserve to be remembered.